On June 24, 1982, something unbelievable happened on a British Airways flight over the Indian Ocean. All four engines of the Boeing 747 suddenly stopped working. As if struck by a bolt of lightning, the aircraft was suddenly powerless. The big plane started falling from the sky with 261 people on board. The pilots knew they had only a few minutes to fix the problem before crashing into the ocean. What happened next is an amazing story of courage, teamwork, and staying calm in a very scary situation. On the evening of June 24, 1982, a British Airways Boeing 747 was preparing for the next leg of its journey. 3 pilots and 12 flight attendants boarded the aircraft at Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Waiting inside were 248 passengers, most of whom had already been on the plane for nearly a day, having started their journey back in London at Heathrow Airport. The flight, known as BA9, had already made a couple of stops. After leaving London the previous day, the plane touched down in Bombay, India, before arriving in Kuala Lumpur. The passengers were on a long journey. Their next stop would be Perth, followed by Melbourne, before finally reaching their destination in New Zealand. It had been a routine flight so far, but what awaited them in the skies over Indonesia was anything but ordinary. No one on board had any idea that they were about to face the greatest challenge of their lives. The fate of everyone on the plane would soon depend on the skill and determination of the crew, who would be battling an unseen enemy high above the dark ocean. But for now, everything seemed normal. The captain in command that night was Eric Moody, a 41-year-old pilot. Despite his young age, he was one of British Airways' most experienced 747 captains, with thousands of flying hours under his belt. His career had begun as a glider pilot, a skill that would unexpectedly become crucial on this night. In the cockpit with him were First Officer Roger Greaves, 32, and Flight Engineer Barry Townley Freeman, 40. The flight engineer was especially knowledgeable, an instructor who trained others on the intricate systems of the aircraft. The passengers couldn't have been in safer hands. At 8:28 p.m., the massive jet pushed back from the gate in Kuala Lumpur. Passengers settled in for the 5-hour journey to Perth. The flight was running 30 minutes late due to a delay in Bombay. Usually, a half-hour delay wouldn't matter much, but tonight it would prove to be significant. Captain Moody taxied the plane to the runway. He was at the controls for this leg of the journey. The skies were clear and the winds were calm, ideal conditions for flying. But far beneath them, deep in the Earth's crust, something was stirring 1,300 kilometers southeast of Kuala Lumpur. The Galunggong volcano on the island of Java had started to erupt, spewing massive amounts of ash and dust into the sky, right into the path of Flight 9. At 8:40 p.m., Captain Moody pushed the throttles forward, and the 4 Rolls-Royce engines roared to life. The plane sped down the runway, lifting off into the night. As the aircraft turned southeast toward Perth, everything seemed to be going smoothly. For the first 2 hours of the flight, nothing was out of the ordinary. The captain climbed to 37,000 feet, where the plane would remain for most of the journey to Australia. As the plane cruised at 37,000 feet, the crew performed their routine checks. They made sure the fuel levels matched the flight plan, confirmed the autopilot was on course, and made standard radio calls to air traffic control. At one point, Captain Moody got up to use the bathroom. Before he left, he checked the weather radar to ensure there was no bad weather ahead. The screen showed clear skies, a perfectly calm night. Just moments after the first officer left the cockpit, something incredible happened. The cockpit windows were suddenly lit up by a strange glowing light, what pilots know as St. Elmo's fire. This eerie phenomenon occurs when electrically charged particles discharge on the windscreen and other forward parts of the plane, creating what looks like tiny bolts of lightning. It's completely harmless and nothing new for the crew, but tonight, something was different. Typically, St. Elmo's fire shows up when a plane is flying near thunderstorms, but the pilots of Flight 9 couldn't spot anything on their weather radar. What could be causing this strange display? To be safe, the crew turned on the fasten seatbelt signs and switched the engine start controls to continuous ignition. This step was a safeguard, ensuring the engines would keep running even if they sucked in rain or ice. But instead of calming down, the phenomenon only got stronger. Soon, it was the most intense St. Elmo's fire the crew had ever seen. First Officer Greaves and Flight Engineer Townley Freeman were so amazed that they called for the captain. At that moment, Captain Moody was downstairs, having a casual chat with one of the flight attendants. As he made his way back upstairs, something caught his attention. There was smoke billowing from the base of the floor where the air conditioning came in, and an odd, acrid smell filled the air. It was that electrical burning scent, like the one you'd recognize from the London Underground. Captain Moody's instincts kicked in. Was there a fire in the electronics bay below the cockpit? An onboard fire is every pilot's nightmare. With just 20 minutes to land the plane in such a situation, time was critical. Moody braced himself as he entered the cockpit, expecting his colleagues to be scrambling through fire drills. But when he got there, what he found was something completely different. Instead of a chaotic emergency, he was greeted by the most breathtaking display of St. Elmo's fire he'd ever seen. The 3 men stood in awe as lightning-like streaks of various shapes, sizes, and colors danced across the windscreen. Captain Moody quickly strapped into his seat and checked the weather radar. In his experience, St. Elmo's fire meant thunderstorms, or maybe a thin layer of cirrus cloud, but the radar showed nothing. It was as if they had stumbled upon this light show in perfectly clear air. Looking out his side window, Captain Moody saw something even more unbelievable. The engines were glowing blue, as if lit from the inside. side. The wing's leading edge was also shining like a white-hot blade. First, Officer Greaves glanced out his own window and saw the exact same thing on his side. The spectacle wasn't over yet. It was only beginning. In mere seconds, the St. Elmo's fire on the windscreen transformed into an even more dazzling display. It looked as though thousands of tiny blue tracer bullets were shooting toward the cockpit, like they were entering warp speed, diving headfirst into another dimension. The pilots were stunned. What on earth was going on? Despite the extraordinary light show, everything else seemed perfectly normal. No vibrations, no strange noises, just an eerie calm. But at 8:40 that night, the calm was shattered. Engine number 4, the outer engine on the right side, suddenly failed. Captain Moody immediately called for the engine shutdown checklist, and the crew sprang into action. They moved the thrust lever to idle, cut off the fuel supply, and armed the fire handle just in case. Engine failures aren't common, but with a 4-engine plane like the 747, it wasn't alarming either. The aircraft could easily fly on 3 engines, but before they could even finish the checklist, engines 2 and 3 failed as well, followed immediately by engine 1. The pilots were in disbelief. All 4 engines had failed. Their massive jet, carrying 263 passengers and crew, had just turned into the world's largest glider. In just a few seconds, their awe-inspiring situation had turned into a fight for survival. The fate of everyone on board now rested on whether the pilots could somehow save their crippled aircraft before it plunged into the Indian Ocean below. We couldn't believe what was happening. All 4 engines were failing. It was like a bad dream. How could this be real? It's almost unheard of for all engines to fail at once on a passenger jet. Usually something like this only happens if the pilots make a mistake. With that thought in mind, the captain checked the fuel pumps. Had they accidentally set the engines to draw fuel from just one tank, causing it to run dry? But no, everything was in order. The pumps were pulling fuel from every tank. Next, he checked the electrical system. What if there was a problem there? But again, everything seemed fine. Could it be icing? At their altitude, it was possible that ice had blocked the engines. He quickly turned on the engine anti-ice system, but that didn't seem to be the problem either. The crew was sure they must have made some mistake, but they had to push that thought aside. Now, with the plane falling towards the Indian Ocean, they had one job: restart the engines. If they failed, they would crash into the water in just a few minutes. The captain instructed the first officer to declare an emergency to air traffic control while he and the flight engineer focused on restarting the engines. At this altitude, there was a real risk that without engine power, the plane would slow down too much, stall, and fall out of the sky. To prevent this, the captain pointed the plane's nose down to maintain speed. It was a delicate balance, trading altitude for speed, but no matter how skillfully the captain flew, if the engines didn't start, they were doomed. Without engines, the plane would lose 1 kilometer in altitude for every 15 kilometers it moved forward. From 37,000 feet, they could glide about 165 kilometers, just enough to reach the nearest airport in Jakarta, except for one problem. A massive wall of mountains stood in their way, 3.5 kilometers high. If the engines didn't restart, they would have to do the unthinkable: ditch the fully loaded 747 in the ocean at night. They knew this almost certainly meant death for everyone on board. The pressure was overwhelming, but they had no choice but to focus. Meanwhile, the first officer was struggling to communicate with air traffic control. He tried over and over, but the controller couldn't understand him. The controller seemed to think only one engine had failed when the first officer was trying to say all 4 had stopped. It was hard to believe. On a modern passenger jet, all 4 engines just don't fail. What no one knew yet was that Flight 9 had flown directly into an ash cloud thrown up by the Mount Galunggong volcano. The light show the pilots saw on their windshields was caused by static electricity from the dry ash as the plane flew through it at nearly 1,000 kilometers per hour. This created an electronic cocoon around the aircraft, messing up radio signals. Luckily, a Singapore Airlines 747 was flying a few dozen miles behind them on the same route. The pilots of that flight could hear the first officer more clearly and relayed his messages to Jakarta Air Traffic Control. Finally, the gravity of the situation hit the people on the ground, and the Singapore Airlines flight turned back to avoid the same fate. But the crew of British Airways Flight 9 was on their own. Nothing about this situation matched what they had practiced in the simulator. Despite the loss of almost all electrical power, some systems were still working, while others were errant. Even stranger, the autopilot was still on, giving the captain some relief as he helped with the engine restarts. In the cabin, passengers were terrified. The comforting hum of the engines had been replaced by an eerie silence as the plane descended toward the ocean. Wisps of acrid smoke began filling the cabin, stinging eyes and causing some passengers to cough. But in the cockpit, the smoke wasn't even on the pilot's mind. minds. They had bigger problems. No matter how many times they tried, the engines just wouldn't restart. They were running out of time. Every second, the altimeter showed them dropping closer and closer to the ocean. If they followed the standard procedures, they would only get a few more tries before they hit the water. In a moment of desperation, one of the pilots said, "Forget the book." They shortened the checklist to only the most critical steps and kept trying, again and again. Then, another problem. The plane began to depressurize. Without engines to feed air into the cabin, the oxygen was leaking out. At 26,000 feet, there wasn't enough air to breathe. The pilots reached for their oxygen masks, but the first officer's mask fell apart in his hands. While the captain and flight engineer managed to put theirs on, the first officer, essential to restarting the engines, was now out of the loop, and without oxygen, he would soon lose consciousness. Captain Moody faced an incredibly tough choice. Should he dive to a lower altitude to save his colleague, or stay high to give them more time to restart the engines? After a quick discussion, the captain and flight engineer made their decision. The crew was in a tough spot. If they could get down to 20,000 feet, they could all take off their oxygen masks and work together again as a team. The captain had to make a risky choice. Was it bold or just plain reckless? He decided to trade some of their precious altitude to get his first officer back in the game. He pulled the speed brake and pushed the plane's nose down. The passengers felt it immediately. Their stomachs lurched as the plane dived. The whole aircraft shook as the speed brakes disturbed the air over the wings. It was a dramatic move, all to bring the first officer back into action. Normally, the checklist for this rapid descent would call for the landing gear to be extended, but Captain Moody, knowing that extended landing gear would cause the plane to break apart if they had to ditch in the ocean, ignored that part of the checklist. Within a minute, they had dropped 6,000 feet. Now, at 20,000 feet, the captain pulled back the speed brakes and slowed the plane's descent. Miraculously, the first officer had managed to reassemble his oxygen mask during the dive. The three men were back together as a team, but now, at this lower altitude, they felt an even greater sense of urgency to restart the engines. As if things couldn't get worse, the captain noticed a new problem. Their airspeed indicators didn't agree. His instrument showed 270 knots, while the first officer's showed 320 knots. This difference mattered a lot because the engines needed the plane to be flying between 250 and 270 knots to restart. Outside of that range, they had no chance. Faced with another tough decision, the captain didn't want to gamble on which instrument was correct. Instead, he chose to vary the plane's pitch, moving it up and down to cover both speed ranges. He hoped that by doing this, they would hit the right speed window on at least one of their instruments, giving them a chance to get the engines going. Meanwhile, the passengers were in a living nightmare. Bright flames began shooting out of the engines, lighting up the cabin in red and orange. Smoke was filling the air, and now it looked like the engines were on fire. Some passengers screamed, while others frantically wrote notes to their loved ones, fearing the worst. The pilots, however, were unaware of the flames. Even if they had known, it wouldn't have mattered much. They were focused on restarting the engines. The flames were actually caused by the fuel being ignited outside the engines, a result of their many restart attempts. To calm the passengers, Captain Moody made an announcement that would go down in history as one of the greatest understatements in aviation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a small problem. All 4 engines have stopped. We are doing our damnedest to get them going again. I trust you're not in too much distress." He then called for the chief flight attendant, which was a signal to prepare the cabin for a possible crash landing or ditching in the ocean. The head flight attendant rushed to the cockpit but couldn't understand the captain through his oxygen mask. Rather than waste time asking him to repeat himself, the attendant returned to the cabin to start preparations. The pilots had tried to restart the engines more than a dozen times, but nothing was working. They faced a tough decision. Ahead of them was a towering mountain range, and they were losing altitude fast. If they couldn't get the engines restarted by the time they reached 12,000 feet, they would have to turn around and ditch the plane in the ocean. At night, with no way to see the water, it would be nearly impossible to make a survivable ditching. Despite how hopeless the situation seemed, the crew didn't give up. They were determined, refusing to believe that this was the end. The captain decided to try restarting engine number 4, even though the checklist said it wasn't allowed after they had armed the fire handle. In their desperate situation, restarting the engines was the only priority. As the plane approached 12,000 feet, the altitude at which they would have to turn back, something incredible happened. After countless attempts, engine number 4 roared back to life. The pilots were overjoyed. Captain Moody pushed the engine to its limit, trying to stretch the plane's glide as far as possible. But one engine wouldn't be enough to clear the mountains. They needed at least one more. Then, just 30 seconds later, engine number 3 came online. The crew now had a fighting chance. About a minute after that, the other 2 engines came back to life, pushing the pilots into their seats as they powered up. The first officer radioed air traffic control with the good news. All 4 engines were running again. Disaster had been averted just minutes before they would have crashed into the ocean, but the crew was still in the dark about what had caused the engines to fail in the first place and why they had suddenly restarted. The crew was on edge. After finally getting the engines going again, they were terrified that they might fail once more. Their top priority now was to put as much distance as possible between them and the ocean below. Jakarta Control cleared the flight to climb up to 15,000 feet, and Captain Moody did just that. But as they reached 15,000 feet, the eerie glow of St. Elmo's fire appeared again. This time, the pilots weren't taking any chances. "All right, something's not right here, lads," the captain said. "Let's get out of this." It was clear that something outside the plane was causing trouble. Without hesitation, the captain started descending. But as they descended, engine number 2 on the left side began to shake violently. The entire plane rocked with a loud boom, as if the engine might tear itself off the wing. The shaking was so intense that the captain made the tough call to shut it down. Now, with only 3 engines left, the crew of Flight 9 was going to limp their way back to Jakarta. But 2 big challenges were still ahead, making this next part what the captain would later describe as the most difficult part of the entire ordeal. It was still pitch dark as the pilots flew over Jakarta at 10,000 feet. To avoid pushing the fragile engines too hard, they decided not to touch the thrust levers until they were moments from landing. Instead, Captain Moody used the flaps and speed brakes to slow the plane down, relying on aerodynamic drag rather than engine power. As they prepared to land, air traffic control delivered some bad news. The glide slope at the airport wasn't working. The glide slope is a crucial part of the landing system, providing vertical guidance to the runway. Without it, the pilots would have to do the math themselves, with the first officer calling out heights at different distances from the runway. Normally, this wouldn't be too difficult, especially on a clear night when they could see the runway from miles away. But as they lined up for their approach, something strange happened. The city lights of Jakarta were visible ahead, but where the airport should have been, there was just darkness. The pilots knew where the runway was supposed to be, but for some reason, it wasn't there. The first officer called the tower and asked them to turn up the runway lights. Moments later, the airport appeared right where they expected it, but something was still off. The whole city seemed to be wrapped in a mist, even though the weather was supposed to be clear. They tried using the windshield wipers, but it didn't help. They even wiped down the windshields by hand, but the view outside was still blurry. The lights looked like smudges, with no clear details. Then, the captain noticed a small sliver of clarity on the left side of his windshield. Through it, he could see the runway perfectly. This was odd, but there was no time to figure out what was causing it. The captain needed to land the plane before anything else went wrong. He shifted in his seat, leaning against the window post to get a clear view, with small, careful adjustments to pitch and power, and with the first officer guiding him in, the captain lined up the plane for landing. As they crossed the runway threshold, the captain pulled the engines to idle, and the first officer counted down the altitude: 50, 40, 30, 20, 10, touchdown. The plane touched down gently, and the captain eased on the brakes, letting the nose wheel settle onto the runway. The passengers burst into applause. They had just survived one of the most terrifying flights imaginable. The pilots were relieved, but also puzzled. What could have caused all 4 engines to fail like that? When we landed, and the plane was being towed in, I went downstairs and sat in first class, just thinking about everything. When I got up to go back to my seat, I noticed my hands were black. The flight engineer, Barry, saw them too and said, "I reckon that's volcanic dust." I laughed it off, thinking, where on earth did that come from? The idea of a volcano seemed ridiculous, but a French crew based locally came on board and suggested the same thing. They mentioned a volcano had been erupting down the coast since April. That got us thinking, because we hadn't heard anything about it in our flight documents. Barry checked our paperwork. There was no mention of any volcanic activity. The next day, I was talking to a Rolls-Royce rep who said, "I reckon you flew into a volcano. Don't worry, there was an eruption last night and you got caught in it." I thought, well, let's hope that's what it was, because we still had no idea what had happened. The real confirmation came the next morning. I found a local English newspaper under my door, and the headline read, Mount Galunggong Downs Jumbo. It was only then, 48 hours after the incident, that we realized we had flown into a volcanic ash cloud. This encounter had huge implications for aviation. It led to the creation of volcanic ash advisory centers, VACs, which now monitor volcanic activity worldwide and send out warnings to aviation authorities. These centers have been crucial in preventing similar incidents, like when a volcano erupted in Iceland in 2010 and shut down much of Europe's airspace. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.